Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tangerine Holt. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission based in Canberra, and we're delighted to be part of this presentation. We're very grateful to Queensland University of Technology for hosting us today. Today is the Fulbright Queensland State Day, and we've had a wonderful day of information sessions for various audiences for our Fulbright scholarships, which opens on May 1st and closes on 1st August. So we're looking for the best and brightest minds, and we're on the road show right now, right across Australia. And as part of that, we move our distinguished chairs with us. We have two distinguished chairs right now in country. We have Rick Zilkowski, who's sponsored by DSTO, and he'll be traveling with us across 4 states and territory, as well as Professor Tad Kousser. But today is a very special night for Tad, as we begin the kickoff for the Fulbright Roadshow. And we're delighted that Professor Tad Kousser, who is our Fulbright-Flinders Distinguished Chair in American Political Science, to be with us today. He began his Fulbright in 2015, February, and he's come here with his wonderful family, and I know he's having a lot of fun apart from the research. He's already planned his Fulbright holiday on the weekends, as he tells me. But he has to do some work for us as well. And by that I mean he's sharing his knowledge, and he's a distinguished professor based at UC San Diego. He has written a number of books. We were delighted when we interviewed him, and we're so delighted that he's part of this Fulbright program. And one of the books that he's written is The Logic of American Politics, which is really important in our current environment. As well as, Thad comes with us. He's, apart from being a distinguished academic, he has served in the US Senate and the California State Senate as well. So he comes with a very distinguished career record and a path. And we're so delighted that he's here with us in Australia as part of the Fulbright program to learn more about Australian politics and to take back new ideas and to share with us his ideas. And this evening, it gives me great pleasure to present to you Professor Tad Kousser. His topic is on American political polarization and the presidential race of 2016. Please make him welcome.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Tanj, and thank all of you for showing up tonight. I'm actually sort of surprised to see that there are so many people in the audience tonight. I mean, you know that this is a talk about the November 2016 election. We have fully 568 days to go into this election. We even have 272 days to go until the Iowa caucuses and then the New Hampshire primaries, which are, of course, the contests in these very small and very cold and very unrepresentative states, which are how we pick our nominees to be the next leaders of the free world. And so I'm sort of wondering exactly what you're doing here tonight. But I think your presence here tonight is testimony to your sophisticated understanding of American politics. Because you know that the United States is the land of the constant campaign, right? That there is no political off-season, that when one election closes, the next one begins. You probably saw Hillary Clinton got into the race last week, and you probably, because you're sophisticated, thought to yourself, well, yeah, Hillary's been running for president for about a decade now. So she, like any American politician, knows that it's always election season. So you're here because you know a lot about American politics. And if you're like nearly every Australian that I've met, you know a whole lot about American politics, much more than I know about Australian politics. And so because of that, I can't just do the American Presidency 101 basic introductory course tonight. We're going to have to be a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more advanced. So what we're going to do tonight is to try to take on things that people think they know about the American presidential campaign of 2006. So each of these pictures, and as I'll explain throughout the talk, each of these 5 pictures signifies something that the political cognoscenti think they know about American politics. But we're going to know better. We're going to look a little bit deeper into longer-term historical trends. We're going to look at political science research, and we're going to find out what's really going on beneath the conventional wisdom. For each of these things that people think they know, I'm going to start by telling you what the conventional wisdom is and giving you a little bit of data to see whether it's true or not. But then we're going to dig deeper and look at the numbers behind this. Because I'm only been here for about 2 months and I'm really talking about American politics and still learning a whole lot about Australian politics, I'll throw out a little bit of data, a little bit of some kind of an Australian analogy, but I hope in our conversations we can get more in depth and you can set me straight about your country, as all Australians have done so far. And then we'll draw the lessons for the 2016 election with each of these. And by the end of this course, hopefully, if we've done our jobs, you guys will fulfill the ambition of every professor. The thing that drives us to get our PhD, which is, of course, to appear clever at dinner parties when you're talking about the presidential election. All right? So let's go to the first thing people think they know about 2016. And that is, since this is about polarization, that is that Hillary Clinton, the monumental figure, the one sure contestant that we know in this race, is polarizing. That she is this black and white figure. People either love her or hate her. Nobody has no opinion on Hillary Clinton in the United States of America, and from what I've heard, not even in Australia. All right? And in some ways, she's come to signify the defining political trend of American politics today, which is polarization, particularly partisan polarization. Democrats and Republicans think differently. They think differently about leaders. They think differently about policy issues. They think differently about culture, about religion. They buy different cars, a Prius or a pickup. They drink different kinds of coffee. And there's really this wide gap. So let's look at some basic data, some opinion polls, and see what Democrats and Republicans think of Hillary Clinton to see if she's really so polarizing. Well, if you look at the data, you see clear evidence of polarization. So this is on the y-axis. We have the kind of net favorability ratings of Hillary Clinton among Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. So we put our Democrats in blue, and so we get our colors wrong, according to you guys. And since 90% of Democrats love Hillary Clinton and only 10% of them don't like them, she has an 80% net favorability. Independents are split on her, but slightly positive today. You see a spike with independents and Republicans when she was Secretary of State, and Republicans in general have a very negative view. Only a very small minority of Republicans like Hillary Clinton. So the conventional wisdom there is correct. Hillary Clinton is polarizing, but then there's a question: is she uniquely polarizing? Right? Is she anything different than other major American political figures? So let's look at the person who she hopes to succeed in the Oval Office. Let's look at Barack Obama. This was someone who brought a hope of a new politics in America, and who early on in his when he announced and when he made a famous speech in the Democratic National Convention in 2004, was playing against polarization and trying to be a centrist candidate. Well, this is how Democrats, Independents, and Republicans feel about Barack Obama's performance as president. So every little dot is an opinion poll, and we have the lines tracing him. And what you see is he remains today and has been throughout his presidency a very popular figure among Democrats. He's risen and fallen and is rising again now among independents. And except during a brief honeymoon period, he's always been extraordinarily unpopular among Republicans. He has always been just as polarizing a figure as Hillary Clinton, even though he seemed to offer so much hope. Well, maybe this has something to do with Barack Obama. Maybe it has something to do with race. What if we look back at George W. Bush, who promised to be a uniter and not a divider? Let's see whether he was a polarizing figure. Well, except for what we see there are a few spikes with September 11th and then our entrance into Afghanistan and Iraq, where we see our rally around the flag effect. You see just the same kind of polarization about George W. Bush. And now you should be growing fairly pessimistic about the American political system, and maybe think, maybe this is just the way it's always been. Maybe presidents are always polarizing figures. So now let's look at every president since Dwight Eisenhower, and I'm going to show you a graph that has the net favorability, the difference between the way the two parties think of them, and we'll see whether this is a long-term trend or not. Well, it's actually changed. right? So this is the era we're in today with Barack Obama and George W. Bush, but this is, and it's the difference between how their party thinks of them and how the other party thinks of them. With Dwight, with JFK, even with Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, not centrist figures, you saw, they were more popular among their own party, but not a massive difference. The first time you see, and even Jimmy Carter, a more conservative Southern Democrat, he had both parties liking him or hating him by the end of his term. Ronald Reagan brings a new era of partisan polarization that is then continued, that is then his vice president, George H.W. Bush, turns a bit away from. He's a less polarizing figure. Bill Clinton is also polarizing. And then this polarization that begins around 1980 in the Reagan era, has climbed and continues with George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So what we see is really a sharp break in politics from a kind of a pre-1980 period of relative consensus between the parties and a current period of polarization that seems to be continuing unabated. What does Australia look like in this? Right? Is Australia any better? Right? So remember here that we've got maybe net differences in this era of about 40, 50, 60 percentage points, and now net differences in the 80 or 90 percentage points. Well, let's look at what people think of Tony Abbott. Labor voters hate him. Right? Labor voters are staunchly opposed. 89% disapprove of his performance. Only 5% like his performance. He still has almost all of the coalition. Right? 72% approve, 20% disapprove. So this is a difference of about, 67 percentage points. So what does that look like? How do we fit this into the American context? So that's right about here. So that's right about the Reagan era. So Australia is beginning to polarize, but hasn't quite gotten to where America is in its level of polarization about its political figures. Let's go move back to the United States. What does this mean for Hillary in 2016? Right, she's a polarizing figure. A lot of people don't want her to be the next president. And if you ask people, will she make a good president, you see these kind of worrisome numbers. Only 42% say yes, 52% say no. So that's a 10% percentage point. People think she'll be a bad president. But it takes someone to beat someone. And if you look at the leading contenders from the Republican Party, Jeb Bush, former Florida governor, Chris Christie, New Jersey governor, Rand Paul, Republican senator, and Rick Perry, Texas governor, what you see is for each of them, their favorable ratings aren't that high. Now, once the GOP determines who their nominee will be, that person will be more supported, and those yes numbers will go up. But their no numbers are even higher than Hillary's. So I don't know. So we know one thing for certain: whoever is the next president is going to be a polarizing figure. And the fact that Hillary is polarizing today doesn't mean that that's not a major electoral liability, because whoever her opponent is going to be just as polarizing. Now, what is this polarization and where does it come from? There's been a lot of talk about polarization as being an epidemic of Washington, D.C., and inside the Beltway thing. So this is just a recent book that's an example of this by a longtime Capitol Washington, D.C. reporter called The Second Civil War, How Extreme Partisanship Has Paralyzed America and Paralyzed Washington and Polarized America. And you see the dome of Congress as the primary culprit. And the idea is that Washington, D.C. is polarized on the issues, and that this is what's led to the problems in the United States overall. Well, let's look at this conventional wisdom. Let's look for quantitative data of polarization. Political scientists have studied this for a while and gathered massive data sets of all the votes cast on the floor of Congress in history. And they can use those, and I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A, but they can use those to array the two parties on the left-to-right ideological spectrum. So let's look at where the Democrats are and where the Republicans are first a generation ago in the early 1970s and then today. This is the early 1970s. We see the Democrats on the left in green, the Republicans to the right in orange, but there's some liberal Republicans who are more liberal than the conservative Democrats. There's some crossover between the parties in the 1970s. Washington, D.C. was not a completely polarized city in that era. Let's look at today. You see, the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Republican. Those parts of American politics are extinct. You know, there's this center ground in Australia, and I actually got to spend an hour interviewing Chris Pine, and at the end of it, he said, I think if I were in America, I'd be a conservative Democrat or maybe a liberal Republican. And after hearing him from America, I said, I bet that's right, except those people don't exist anymore in America. And so this is where Washington, D.C. is. And so a lot of people blame this on what's in the water in Washington, D.C. A lot of my research is in the states. And so one thing I did is I looked at archival roll call votes in the state house floors in America's biggest states, New York, Illinois, California, and I looked at where and when polarization happened in these states. And what happened was those states became polarized long before Washington. These are those same graphs in the New York General Assembly. In 1921, it kind of looked like Congress of the 70s. There was a little bit of crossover. By 1941, there was hardly any crossover, and by 1961, the parties had completely polarized, and they've basically been at war ever since. You see the same story in Illinois with Chicago versus the rest of the state, in California with the urban areas versus the rural areas. We see polarization. It's a general phenomenon all across America. It's not something that just happens in Washington. And that's what I think makes it a more permanent phenomenon. Now, what about Australia? Well, in Australia, you don't have all the roll call votes are cast on a party line, and so any divisions you see in the party room, once they go to vote on the floor, those have to go away. So you can't look at people's roll call votes. But the ANU does a great survey of candidates after every election, and by looking at where those candidates are on 28 different issues, I was able to come up with the same sorts of scores to look at Australia's parties. So let's look at where the two major parties are in Australia. You've got the coalition on the right, you've got Labor on the left, but there's a good amount of crossover. Your small L liberals are more leftish than some of the Labor right, and you see sort of a couple bumps with the Labor left and a Labor right. If you overlay the Green Party on this, you see them being even more liberal, though not quite as far off to the left as I thought they would have been, but this survey didn't have too many environmental questions. So Australia looks really more like Congress of the 1970s. So Australia is moving towards a polarization that's in some ways like the United States, but it isn't there yet. So Australia hasn't quite, no one's writing the same kinds of books about the demise of Australian politics that they are about the United States. What does that mean for our presidential elections? Well, this nationwide polarization has contributed to really what you guys would call a rusting on of American voting trends. There are some states that are blue states and some states that are red states. And if you see this map, this is the blue state, red state, with the Republican states in red and the blue states and the coast and the upper Midwest as Democratic states. This is the map in 2012. This is the map in 2008. And then don't blink, this is that same map in 2000. It's basically the same thing. And so this is the map that we're going to see in 2016. There will be this very small number of battleground states that both parties will be contesting, but you're not going to see much difference in the general contours because American politics has become sort of calcified and solidified by its polarization all across the nation. All right. One thing that Republicans are looking for is a map that looks more like this, a map with more red states, and red states especially in these areas like Virginia, North Carolina, and Colorado. But what many pundits in Washington, D.C. have claimed is that the Republican Party will never get a map like they saw in 2000 because those areas have seen such demographic change over the last decade. That these are areas where you've seen huge increases in the Latino population and also the Asian American population. And that demographic change in America, that this diversification of America's political culture is going to spell doom for the Republican Party and make the GOP elephant here an endangered species. That's the conventional wisdom, and it's backed up, if you look at polling, by the fact that the fastest growing ethnic groups are strongly Democratic. So this is Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney, and you see Barack Obama doing very well among African Americans, and Bill Clinton before him did that, so that's no surprise. Latinos, though, or Hispanics, both terms mean the same thing, 71 to 27 with Barack Obama in the last election. Asian Americans also strongly Democratic, and in fact, the poll that did an oversample found that every ethnic origin group, Japanese American, Chinese American, Korean American, even Vietnamese Americans, all voted in favor of Barack Obama. These groups are growing, and they're growing as a share of the electorate. So this is what the American electorate looks like In 1988, it was 85% white, 10% black, 4% Latino, and a negligible proportion Asian American. In the last election, down to 74% white, 13% African American, 8% Latino, 3% Asian American. And if you look at the population, not the electorate, population, because we don't make everyone vote here, and what the population is projected to be in 2060, this looks bad for the Republican Party, right? This sort of looks like demographics will be destiny for the Republican Party if the Republican Party is this base, this shrinking base of white voters. Well, if that were true, why did the Republican Party win overwhelmingly in the last election in November 2014, winning the House by a large margin and taking back the Senate? Well, if you look behind these numbers, okay, Barack Obama was doing and Democrats were doing great among all these groups, but what about whites? Barack Obama's share of the white vote, only 39%, was worse than any candidate since Michael Dukakis in 1988, a Democrat who barely, hardly carried anything and lost in a landslide. So Republicans, by taking a strong stand on preserving our borders and cracking down on illegal immigration, have done increasingly poorly among the new ethnic immigrant groups, but increasingly well among white voters. They faced a strategic dilemma after 2012 when all the pundits were telling them, they needed to loosen up on immigration and be more immigrant friendly. The Senate passed a bill. The House said no to it. The Republicans sort of doubled down on their strategy of securing the borders, and that paid off in the 2014 election, in large part because when you get to an off-year election in 2014, when you don't have a president on the ballot, you have much lower turnout in American elections, and that electorate plays to the Republican strengths. So these two bars, the darker bars are what the electorate looked like in 2014, the lighter bars, or in 2012, the lighter bars in 2014, you saw a whiter electorate in 2014 in the midterm, and you also saw a much older electorate. Instead of having more 20-somethings than senior citizens, it had far more senior citizens. So the Republican Party that's become increasingly the party of older white Americans can do extremely well when you have an election when mostly older white Americans show up. And I think this means that the demographics aren't destiny for the Republican Party, but it leaves the Republican Party in a tenuous position. It's also a position, there should be echoes of Australian politics on immigration in this, although one of my frustrations here, and I'd love to hear suggestions, is trying to figure out how ethnic groups vote in Australia. I read through a whole book of studies about the 2013 election and found no breakdown of the ethnic votes. I couldn't find it in any poll. I found a few people who wrote about it, with one scholar talking about the myth of the ethnic vote in 1996 and the Daily Telegraph saying that it was going to be pivotal in 2013. But in some ways, it's un-Australian to break down your electorate that way, and it doesn't fit with Australian political culture. So I'll be interested as I stay here more to learn more about the ethnic vote. But in the United States, there's nothing we love more than to separate ourselves into ethnic groups and look at voting and talk about the dilemmas that this puts the party in. In particular, the lesson for 2016 for the Republican Party is they face two potential courses. One is to go with an immigrant-friendly candidate. Like, this is Marco Rubio, the young Florida senator who brokered the deal on immigration that was more immigrant-friendly in the Senate in 2013. According to the New York Times recently, if the Republicans nominate Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, they're going to expand the party's appeal by reconnecting with Hispanic voters. But if they go the other way, even with a Latino candidate, Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, but he's taken a much harder line, anti-immigration, secure the borders line. If they do this, they're going to sort of capitalize on disaffected conservatives, evangelical Christians, and that older, wider base with which Republicans do better. So it's really an open question as to which of these strategies would pay off in November 2016 for Republicans. What about the Democratic Party? So they weren't jubilant after 2014, and in fact, many people were saying that the lesson of the 2014 elections was that Democrats, when Barack Obama wasn't on the ticket, Democrats were in real trouble, that this was a party that was breaking up. And the Democrats' legislative losses in our Senate and House races spelled a post-Obama doom for the party, that a candidate who wasn't, Hillary Clinton, who is not thought to have that same charisma and that same appeal as Obama, that same Obama magic, that the Democratic Party may find it hard to win in 2016. What do the numbers tell us about this? Well, it was a terrible election for Democrats in 2014. This is the red-blue map of the Senate. You see a lot more red, and in fact, the lightly shaded states are the new Senate seats picked up by the Republican Party that exceeded most everyone's expectation in recapturing the Senate by a large margin, and doing it even in some areas that had voted for Democrats in recent presidential elections. Very few victories for Democrats, and only in the bluest states. If you look at the House, what you see is a Democratic Party. This is the losses by the President's Party in every midterm election since 1950. What we saw is George Bush took a thumping in 2006, lost control of the House. Barack Obama said that he took a shellacking in 2010, and then continued to lose even more seats in 2014. So it's been two very rough midterms, and the Democrats failed to even recapture the House during the presidential election. It's been a series of bad elections for Democrats at the congressional level, losing control of Congress in the last 3 elections. Does this mean that the Democratic Party brand is in trouble and the Democratic Party really has been underperforming in recent years? Well, if you look at the states that the Democrats had to perform in the Senate, it shouldn't be surprising that the Republicans took things back. So our senators have 6-year terms, and all the seats, meaning that all the seats that were at play in 2014 were the ones that the Democrats had won in 2008 on Barack Obama's coattails and when the Republican Party was being blamed for the global financial crisis. So this was a high watermark for Democrats in the Senate and all those seats, and they won all these seats that they shouldn't have won because of those 2008 coattails, and they just lost them in 2014. It wasn't that unexpected. These were states that voted strongly against Barack Obama in 2012 and in favor of Mitt Romney. And in fact, if you think about those demographic dynamics, these were states that had very few of the new immigrant populations that the Republican Party had alienated with its stances on immigration. So if you look at the percentage of eligible voters these were the Senate states that were the big swing Senate states in 2014. In the United States as a whole, averages about 11% of the electorate is Latino. Colorado is the only state above that average, but all these other states had almost negligible proportions of Latinos. So this was really tough territory for Democrats to defend, especially when they were seen as the party of immigrants in 2014. If you look at the House, the Democrats actually haven't been doing that poorly. What this graph shows, every dot on this, these are polls starting in the late 90s. Who do you want to vote for Congress? Just, asking a national poll, this generic poll. That's what all those dots are. The red triangles are the percent of the vote nationwide in congressional districts won by the Democrats. The green squares are the percent of seats that they got. And what you see is increasingly, through this period, the Democratic brand has been at over 50%. And even in 2012, the Democrats actually won more than 50% of the vote for members of Congress, but only got 46.2% of the seats. In this last election, they won 47% of the vote and only got 43% of the seats. So the Democrats aren't doing all that terribly. The problem for the Democrats is their voters are packed together in cities. They're living together in cities that are all strongly Democratic. There's been this big move back to the cities, and they're living in districts that are 85% Democratic. That wastes a lot of votes, right? You only need 50.1% to win. Republicans are winning in the suburbs in these much more evenly matched areas. And so because of just this sort of sorting of where Americans live, the Democratic Party looks like they're doing worse when you count up the seats than they actually are when you count up the votes. The Democratic brand is actually not all that terrible. And this is actually something that shouldn't be alien to you in Australian politics, because this has happened before, and we've seen reformers complain about it. So Meg Lees, the senator, had a study when she was arguing for reform in the last decade, showing that in 5 elections in Australia, the party that won the two-party preferred vote did not control government because of this same sort of sorting. In Australia, South Australia, the last few elections have been wrong winner elections. The Liberal Party has won more of the vote. The Labour Party has won more of the seats because Liberals are dominant in these rural areas, and so they have all these 85% victories, and Labour is winning the suburbs and the key swing votes. So you see the same kind of thing in Australia. What does this mean for the Democratic Party brand? Well, in 2016, the Democrats are going to have a much better chance of doing well in the Senate because they're going to be playing defense a lot less. Republicans are going to have to defend 24 seats, and Democrats only defend 10 seats. And so that means there's a good chance for Democrats to make inroads into the Republican control of the Senate, maybe even flip the Senate. And if you look at all voters' images of the Democratic Party, it's not so great. 47% like it, 48% hate it. But if you look at Republicans, it's even worse. Right? The Republican Party brand is suffering today in America with only 39% support, and it especially does poorly with minority groups, blacks, Asian Americans, and Latinos. So in the general, forgetting about who the presidential candidate will be, in the general brand names of the parties, Democrats seem to be winning right now, and will look for a better demographic in 2016 than they had in 2014. So what does that mean for who the next president's going to be, right? That's why you guys are all here. You want to see the prediction. You want me to tell you who the next president's going to be. And I'm going to show you on the next slide who the next American president is going to be. It's going to be one of these people. Political scientists don't like to make fools out of ourselves that much by predicting things. I'm really even playing it way safe by putting faces other than Hillary on the Democratic end. And that's because there's this conventional wisdom that political campaigns are really unpredictable. Or maybe that they're entirely predictable. You hear both of those. And here's my take as an academic. General elections are very predictable. So political scientists have developed models that look basically at 3 to 5 months out from an election. You tell us what the GDP growth is, what the unemployment level is, and whether you have an incumbent running for re-election. We can predict pretty well what the vote share will be and who the winner is going to be. And there's a whole special issue of a journal published with everyone's predictions, and they generally do pretty well in most election years. If you add to that the incredible polling data that Nate Silver and others put together, we get great data. And there's a guy at Emory University named Drew Linzer has I think the best website on this called Votomatic. Go to votomatic.org. Basically takes the models based on the fundamentals of elections, updates them with this polling data, and here were his predictions across the course of an election about how many electoral votes each of these candidates would win. They were really good. They were really stable. They didn't dip that much depending on who said what in what debate. If you take the general basics of an election, he got to the prediction a lot better, a lot more quickly than Nate Silver did. So general elections are predictable. Primaries, on the other hand, look nothing like this. So this is the Republican primary in 2012 where you see a spaghetti graph, right? Now the only constant you have is Mitt Romney. About a quarter of Republicans were always in favor of him, and by the end of the election, the other 3/4 of Republicans kind of held their nose and voted for someone who they didn't really love, someone who wasn't with the kind of conservative Tea Party heart of the party. And the Tea Party kept trying out all these other candidates. First Michelle Bachmann, then Texas Governor Rick Perry, who said he wanted to shut down multiple departments of government, and then was asked in a debate to say which ones, and he could only name one department of government. And then he started to crash after that. Herman Cain, the pizza entrepreneur who had his moment in time, Rick Santorum, Newt Gingrich, everyone had their moment in time, but they went up and down as people were trying to figure out who the focal point would be, who the anti-Mitt Romney point would be. The Tea Party basically didn't have a lot of credible candidates in that election. In this election, they do. So not only do you have Ted Cruz, who's gotten into the race already representing the Tea Party wing, but you have Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who has challenged unions and taken them on and won 2 elections in a generally blue state of Wisconsin. You have Rand Paul, who's libertarian, who's very much to the right on some issues and very much to the left on others, but is often a Tea Party favorite. Congressman Paul Ryan, the budget chair. You have real credible candidates. Senator Ted Cruz, who has that big state national politics experience. Real credible candidates on the right of the Republican Party, and you have Jeb Bush, a reliable brand name who has experience in the more moderate wing of the Republican Party, and it's going to be a fascinating fight over the next 272 days as we count down to the Iowa caucuses to watch. Well, that's all my prepared remarks, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions. So I don't know if we need to do a microphone, but why don't we just get into things? Okay. All right. Thanks very much.
Hi, just a question regarding the Hispanic vote. I think this is on. Is this on?
I heard you.
Okay, that's not working. I'll just speak loudly. It's a really good, interesting fact.
There we go.
There we go. So NBC News is not very good at telling the truth. They sometimes lie. But it's probably a question regarding Judge...
They are not the neutral, always reliable media that the Australian media is.
Yeah, they like to...
Sorry, is that okay to say as a Fulbright?
They do like to get into choppers and, make it up as they go. The question I've got is regarding Chuck Todd's comments regarding Georgia, Texas, and Arizona being states in play is this election. Do you agree?
So that analysis is really based on the demographic change of these areas and these areas becoming increasingly Latino. So these are all states. Arizona, that has been really, that was John McCain's heartland, so that was where he came from. Texas has been reliably red for a while, and Georgia, that it really since for about the last decade. It's a Democratic-dominated state, and then moved to the right over the last decade. It would be, I would be surprised if these states changed, but the turnout machine the Democratic Party has assembled over the last few elections is quite impressive, and I think so. The Democratic Party has really embraced a lot of what we call randomized experiments. So you try to figure out what really drags people to the polls by doing what doctors do, by doing experiments where some people randomly get this one injunction to go to the polls and some people don't. There's a great book on this called The Victory Lab that was written in talking about how these political science techniques translate into politics. Democrats have been doing, and academics have been doing a huge number of experiments on minority and immigrant voting groups and really sharpen tools and ways to reach out to minority groups. So it would take a Herculean turnout effort to change those states' demographics into a functional electorate that could put them in play in the presidential race, but that is a possibility based on their changing demographics.
Oh, just knocked a glass over. Sorry. I was actually interested in the phenomenon of polarization and rusting on, I suppose. Yeah. I suppose since the Reagan era, what are the commonly accepted explanations, I suppose, for that phenomenon?
Well, part of it is this is a return to old patterns in American politics. So if you look at the long-term trend in polarization, boy, after the Civil War, we were pretty polarized, and the parties were really distinct in Congress, and that was also true during in the immediate wake of the Depression. The 1950s, 60s, and 70s were this low period of polarization, and part of it was brought by this strange and almost corrupt bargain in American politics, which is that on civil rights issues, the South voted. The South voted consistently Democratic for presidential races and sending people to Congress, and in exchange for that, the Democratic Party bottled up most civil rights reform until the late 1950s and early 60s with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and that was so it was this deal that we were going to keep Southern conservative Democrats in the Democratic fold by not threatening the interest of the Southern states, And political scientists railed against this. So now we rail against polarization, but in the 1950s, political scientists were talking about the problem of American politics. So parties don't stand for anything, and you can vote for one. You can vote for Democrats in the North, and you get a different thing from Democrats in the South. The undoing of that bargain, I think, changed American politics. It led conservative voters in the South and in rural areas in the rest of the country to see that the new Democratic Party and also the post-Watergate Party wasn't really the party that represented them. And they began to switch to the Republican Party when Ronald Reagan came in and was a charismatic figure who was able to articulate a small government vision. More of them flowed to him, and what you had was the Reagan Democrats, who were kind of like the Howard Battlers, people switching their parties, many of them sort of blue-collar voters switching their parties. And what you see is an alignment that in many ways makes sense. If you're a liberal, now you're a Democrat. If you're a conservative, now you're a Republican. Why should there be crossover? The party brand names mean something, and in some ways we've returned to a steady state in American politics rather, from an anomalous period of the 1950s caused by that civil rights era.
Hi. So I've been lucky enough to hear a lot of political scientists in Australia discuss the concept of compulsory voting and the role it served in Australia to bring election campaigns more to the center. And I'd be curious to hear what you think compulsory voting might do for America and election campaigns and this phenomenon of polarization.
Yeah, so it's a plausible story to say that polarization, and that one of the contributing factors to polarization in America is that parties have to play to their base to get that base to turn out. Right? And then in a country where you don't have to play to your base, you don't have to take those positions because of compulsory voting. Now that's totally plausible. One of the problems with making these Australia-American comparisons is we only have 2 cases, and there are infinite numbers of possible causes of what brings the difference between Australian politics and American politics. Another thing that makes me skeptical of that story to some extent is the fact that in Australia, you don't have to worry about your base not turning out. What you do have to worry about is about your base defecting to another party. And for the Labour Party, that's the Greens, right? And they are a real credible electoral threat to the Labour Party now. So why hasn't the challenge of the Greens? So it's the same kind of problem of, Democrats are worried about losing their base to not turning out. The Labour Party, but you can fight that. You can buy your way out of that with a lot of people knocking on doors if you're the Democratic Party. If you're the Labour Party, you've lost all these votes. Inner Melbourne, you're now losing a House seat to the Greens, so you should be moving to the left to respond to the Greens if people's positions were really as flexible and if they were able to move to the left and kind of abandon where they've stood over the course of their career. So that's something that makes me a little bit doubt that theory, although I'd be fine with compulsory voting.
We'll take 2 final questions, please.
I was just wondering about polarization as well, and with the sort of sample of 2. What about the UK and Germany and Scandinavia, and do you see this trend towards polarization elsewhere in the world aside from America and perhaps Australia?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great sort of comparative research project that a lot of political scientists are working on. One of the things is it's harder to look at polarization in these countries that have such clear party discipline. So one of the reasons we can do it in America and chart it by our votes on the floor is because all of these votes are conscience votes, and everyone can split on them. In Australia, you can't do that, so you have to find other mechanisms. So I can show you data on people's positions in surveys, but what do those really mean? It's an anonymous survey. I'm also gathering data on members of Parliament's tweets and having humans code them, and then we're teaching computers to do some machine learning to try to code all the tweets. We're looking at what people say in the House Hansard and what people say in their inaugural speeches, their maiden speeches, and where they lay out their ideology. Political scientists are increasingly borrowing these text as data, these big data techniques from computer scientists, and using them to analyze party platforms in Europe and statements by politicians in other countries. But because of that, we're behind in the comparative study of polarization. We're behind America, and it'll be a few years before we're able to systematically answer that question.
Do you see a correlation between polarization and partisan politics as well, and the result of that, you see where that what are the implications of where that's leading to with incredible electoral swings and consistency in policy reform in the long term.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So what does this do to actual governing? Right. What we know from the American context is that polarization doesn't necessarily lead to gridlock unless there's divided government, right? So if one party has full power and has all, as Barack Obama did with a Democratic Congress and the Democratic Senate when he was first elected, what we saw was a big swing to the left. No gridlock. We saw universal health care. We saw financial deregulation. We saw a stimulus bill, a once-in-a-generation set of policy achievements. But then when politics is divided and you have a Republican House and a Democratic president, polarization makes the cost of that even dearer. And it accentuates the effect of divided government on gridlock. And there are studies that look at 50 years of American history that show this quantitatively, or you can just read the newspaper and see that nobody in one party wants to give the other party a victory. And is that all that different than Australia? Right? I mean, that's part of the narrative now. You hear, one party saying the other party's being obstructionist just for pure obstructionism's sake. And they just don't want to cut a deal with us because they don't want to give us credit for that. And this seems to me to be a difference from the era of the 1980s when the Liberal Party went along with market reforms passed by a Labour Prime Minister because they were the right thing to do, and they didn't. It wasn't death to them to give him credit for this. So I think that's I think that's the worry for Australian politics as it begins to drift towards the United States. It's not quite there in polarization, but if the divide between the parties leads to a policymaking divide and gridlock in Canberra, that will be something to worry about. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I'll be hanging out and looking forward to chatting, and thanks so much for coming out.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being part of this wonderful presentation. And thank you, Ted. You've done us proud for a very informative and back-to-the-future discussion on politics and polarization. Thank you, and thank you for having been with us most of the day on different fronts, scholars, alumni, presenters, and in particular, thank you to the AV staff here and to QUT staff. Steve, you did a fabulous job. Thank you so much. Thank you for the team that worked so hard to pull all of these events today together for the Fulbright Queensland Day. Congratulations. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.